Cape Independent podcast, your weekly update. I'm here with Robert King and myself, Yvonne. So today we are going to head into really the biggest news story coming out of the Cape this week, which is that the mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Hildreth, has announced his candidacy for uh, fed, being federal head of DA. His statement, I must say, was rather uninspiring in a way, not necessarily bad in any way, but mostly the same stuff that we've been hearing for quite a while. I feel that he's, well, one, I think based on everything we know about the inner workings of the DA and particularly Jordan Hilder's role in that, I think we can say most likely outcome of this election is going to be Jordan Hilder as president of the DA as federal head. But I think from some of the initial statements that he's made about his candidacy, we can make uh, some tentative assumptions about the sort of leader he wants to be seen as, and the sort of leader he's going to try uh, rally the DA behind. In his speech, I feel he's really hammering this sort of idea of there's a need for unity both within the DA and across the country, which I don't know about Europe. Sort of, I've sort of not necessarily just a journalist, but it is sometimes tiring hearing about the talk of needing unity. Whenever this brings up, it's almost always framed in a sort of for the sake of everyone, we need to unite behind what I want to do and the way and what I want to get done. Uh, this is sort of very, unfortunately, this is sort of very common thinking in South Africa. This notion of
It's the problem of
you know,
centralization and majoritarianism too. I mean, it always forces people to go in that direction because if you're, making all the decisions from one centralized power center, you kind of have to get behind at least one vision of sorts in order for it to be effective. You can't have five conflicting different visions, which I guess is what we've got at the GNU right now. Each ministry's kind of got its own vision and ideology pushing it forward. It just goes together in a really messed up way as a result. So I guess there is an element of truth there, but the solution isn't really just to try and keep on fighting this hopeless game at the national level. It's to pursue a policy of radical and real decentralisation at the municipal level in Cape Town and at the provincial level in the Western Cape.
yeah, I mean, absolutely, and unfortunately, that just doesn't come through in his statement. Whatever we can read into this, it's very clear that uh, Jordan Lewis very much intends to sort of toe the line that we're hearing about the government of national unity by the DA, this idea that whatever its flaws are, it's ultimately the best chance we've had of reversing the decline. And of course, even if we don't get that, then at least it's not a doomsday coalition, which sort of insinuates would be the end of the country in a way, as opposed to,
Which might not
I
be the
suppose,
worst thing in the world.
yeah, yeah. Well, what's more exciting, a managed decline that is maybe going to pan out over the course of 30 years, or a big bang that we just who knows what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it
But
comes back to that frog boiling metaphor, doesn't it? I mean, if you're a frog and you're in the pot and it's slowly heating up, you keep on adjusting your body temperature until you eventually, overheat and die. It's far more easier to be just, well, it's far better actually to be thrown in the boiling pot as the frog, so you can immediately hop out. But yeah, managed decline, as we've seen over the last 30 years of managed decline, people just adapt and adapt and adapt. And in some ways, look, maybe it's been fast enough so that we have seen that parallel institutions being developed as a result, and that's what I'm going to talk about later with the Future of Nations segment. But I mean, if it was faster, we'd probably see more aggressive approaches towards things like self-determination as a result.
Yeah, I agree. I think also there's just there's a sort of discontinuity with the state of the decline as well. South Africa is still a country where if you have money, it is a phenomenal place to be, right? Everything is so much more affordable than you would get in a first world country. Uh, so maybe the people who should be the most ready to apply pressure to the political leaders are not really feeling the heat in that. You know? I sort of think back to probably the closest the country ever got to actual elite revolt was when Jacob Zuma tried to elect, I think it was Desmond van Rooyen as head of the Ministry of Finance, and I it was oh goodness, it was pretty intense. The rand dropped by like 30% one weekend. It was yeah. If
It
there's
was one of my
ever a
earliest
case,
p- political memories, that one, because I was in the scout. So I was very young at the time. I was in the scouts, and it was over the December period, so we were camping somewhere. Um, and it was by this lake, so there was like a clubhouse, and there was a radio in the clubhouse. And I wasn't too aware of politics, but I heard on one of the days we had a new finance minister appointed. And then 2 days later, it was like, okay, this guy's been fired, and we got a new person in place. And I was like, okay, that was a bit
yeah,
strange. And then my parents actually came to the campsite early to pick us up because there was big Zoom must fall protests taking place the next day in Cape Town, and that was pretty much our first major political involvement in something as a family in South Africa. But yeah, that's just a decide on that point.
yeah. I mean, it was honestly something that just it doesn't really get the attention it deserves at, when we talk about South Africa's history. The this is an aside, but the I think when it comes to sort of elite consensus about South Africa, whether this is something worth holding on whole country, it's really quite dependent on the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank. There's
Mm.
even under the Mbeki, things obviously going wrong with some of the low-level corruption. It was the sense of like, well, as long as Trevor Emmanuel's there, as long as Mbeki's there to make sure the the big playing institutions are in good shape, then everything will be fine. And I think when we talk about the potential leaders of the government of national unity, very likely to change in the next 2 years. Jordan Hill Lewis has throwing his hat in. I'm sure he must be favourite by some distance to take charge. And then on the other end, we have a lot of speculation about Patrice Motsepe potentially running to be ANC president. Very similar to Jordan Hill Lewis in a way, in the sense that if he's running, he will win. Whether he will run is a different question right now. But I think there's this desire, this sort of consensus building, especially when we hear people like Franz Cornea talk about going back to the Mbeki years for some inspiration. We're sort of getting this consensus building that what South Africa really needs is to sort of, you know, almost work backwards and sort of reconstitute the Mbeki years. Sort of have to get back to this position where we can grow quickly and still fund the social program, still expand the social program. But we have to do that almost exactly the same way we did in the past with the sort of really quite extreme centralization that happened within the ANC, I should say, under the Mbeki years. But I think I don't know about you, but I think John Hill Lewis is going to be very much a continuation candidate, let's say, with the DA's relationship. with the DA, especially if, as I'm describing, this sort of consensus does form within the.
No, no, it's a very interesting point, and I can see a lot of challenges emerging too. So yeah, it's very interesting the point about Mbeki that you mentioned though, because obviously it was in that time as well that the ANC had a huge working majority too. It was nearly, I think, between 2004 and 2009, it was about 70% of the seats in Parliament. And maybe you can look at the current GNU as sort of a reconstitution, or at least a desperate attempt to reconstitute that ANC. If you add the ANC and the DA and the IFP together, they get close to 70% of the seats in Parliament. Um, and yes, I mean, you obviously see the DA. They went, obviously virtually every promise they made in the elections was effectively broken afterwards, and they've said this basically openly that they've got to change based on the changing political circumstances. But I mean, you see that for example with the foot and mouth epidemic and how they've approached that. It hasn't really been an approach that has trusted the hardworking, very smart and competent farming communities in the country. It's been an approach saying, well, look, we've got this broken government department. Let's try and centralize as much as of the procurement through this department, through BE contracts, which massively inflates the prices. So in many ways, yes, there's like a slight alteration here and there. They can make a slight change where no one really cares too much and put out a press release saying we made this change here. But at the end of the day, it's all coming back to that, general ANC policy that's being implemented. And yeah, I don't know. Look, we'll see how Jordan Hill Lewis approaches it compared to Steenhuisen. Obviously, there's going to be a big change in dynamics there in the sense that Steenhuisen is actually a minister in the government, and Jordan Hill Lewis is going to be obviously we're still going to try and be mayor of Cape Town. So that's going to create some very difficult dynamics, I can imagine, because when you're a minister, you've obviously got far easier access to the president than you would otherwise. I remember what Kwame Muls has been saying on a number of occasions. I think he's getting his first one-on-one meeting as leader of the Freedom Front with Cyril later in, I think, March. I think it's the 17th of March, I think he said, is his first meeting that he's had one-on-one with Cyril since he became leader of the Freedom Front. And that's because obviously he's serving as a party leader outside of the national executive. Now, obviously, the DA is a far larger party, probably won't be as challenging, but nonetheless, those challenges will likely still emerge. And I think we're going to probably see Jordan Hill Lewis. He could potentially be a very weak DA leader. I mean, maybe one of the weakest DA leaders we've seen, depending on how the local election results go in at the end of this year, because obviously he's going to have to split his time running the campaign for Cape Town mayor with the national campaign too. And the DA in the past, when they were largely a regional Cape-based party, or their only real prospects of electoral success was in the Cape, that might have worked back then, to run a dual campaign in that regard. But now, as Jordan Hill Lewis is going to try and oversee this national campaign where you've got Johannesburg, you've got Pretoria, you've got Durban taking place, and you've got to focus on Cape Town, where his popularity has suffered in the last year. As a result, of course, of those massive rate increases, but also with the growing public awareness of the land invasion issue, I think those are going to compound to potentially make him a weak leader, especially if they lose their majority in Cape Town later this year.
Yeah, no, and I think I completely agree. I think if the best case scenario for the PA is if local government elections, whatever happens, they maintain their stronghold in Cape Town. Jordan Lewis doesn't have to spend his whole tenureship as leader of the PA, potentially getting maybe stuck in just keeping the city together. That's if they do potentially fall below 50%. But I still think that overall, as long as as long as the DA we have such we have really strong name recognition with people like Helen Ziller, there is a bit ironically there is a bit more leeway for sort of the decentralized uh, uh, appeal in the party. course, now really hammering her Joburg identity. I'm going to be completely honest. I forgot for a while that she was even originally from Joburg, but
Hillbrow.
she's yeah, of course, and she's been a lifelong Pirates fan, as we've been reminded after a decade of never speaking about them. But I mean, it's a good time to find footing as a Pirates fan, I suppose. But if, I think the, it could be an issue, especially if as it turns out that maybe we're wrong about Dawn Hilder's position within the DA. Maybe it's not actually as popular and it's going to require some serious uh, wheeling and dealing within the party to actually get him elected. I can't imagine that that would be the case, but it's very difficult to tell from the outside. So there
Well, it
could
doesn't
be
look
some.
contested at the moment. It does seem
No,
like it's that there is a desire there to have a unity candidate in the form of Jordan Hill Lewis. But we've learned, for example, with the Steanazen saga, that there are these different. Well, we've known it for a while, but there are these different ideological factions with the DA. So there is apparently I think it was Steanazen who described it as a MAGA faction of the DA that exists that wants to, exit
where
the
have they been?
GNU. Yeah, well,
Where
look,
have they been?
I think that the only person in the manufacturer that I'm aware of is Michael Walters, who's the um, he's one of the members of the provincial parliament in Gauteng, and he's the only DA member who I've seen post on X favourably about Cape independence. At some point, there's a post from him. If you go back in, I think it was 2021 or 2022, where he, the post seems quite favourable towards it. But that's beside the point. But so it will be interesting to see how John Hill Lewis is able to deal with these more woke elements in the party that exist and obviously want to push it in a particular direction, obviously with the GNU and everything, and then how this MAGA faction, quote unquote, is going to be handled as well. Are there going to be any concessions handed over in that direction? Are we going to maybe see the DA remain in the GNU, but are they going to be more aggressive within the GNU, maybe to the point of either being comfortable with being thrown out by the ANC or being prepared to leave on their own accord? We'll just have to see what happens there. Um, but look, I wouldn't hold my breath of any radical changes from Jordan Hill Lewis. And I think, yeah, it could end up being a very, very chaotic period of time, depending on what happens in the local campaign in Cape Town.
Yeah, no, I agree. It definitely seems like this has a very pre-planned, well-paved path for Jordan Lewis to assume his role as leader of the PA. We'll have to see closer to the time, but for now, even it arguably it's too soon to really say who's exactly in the running, apart from one candidate we know has officially thrown his hat. But I think on that point, while it's still some interesting speculation about maybe what's going on behind, all we can really say for sure is that he wants to be seen as a unity candidate both for the party and for the country. We'll see how that pans out. Uh, but I think onto our second story, if you're ready to move on, or any last thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to say, I just see we've had a couple comments in the chat from Dry Skiing saying, "Hi chaps, I agree. GNU will hold. The elites have decided. Will be very centralised. But when the elite boomers start becoming unproductive and die, will the GNU collapse? Will what happened at UCT 2016 spread? From 2035, will we see the final step of NDR decolonization? Question mark." And it is a very interesting point because obviously from a demographic point of view, South Africa is moving to becoming even more of a black country. And if we look at the demographics, electoral demographics that come from polling, younger voters are in some ways actually quite, I think if I remember correctly, they were very strongly aligned with the EFF and the ANC to large degrees, and hardly at all with the DA. So it was like, I think 40%. I'm just, trying to remember, but I think it was something like 40% ANC, 40% radical black nationalist, and then like 10% DA. That was some polling before the last election. Um, so yeah, I think this it's managed decline at the end of the day. I think we're going to see maybe the GNU keep things going as they are at the moment, slowly downwards. And in the same time, the DA is going to be pushed to the left in that process. So the entire political center of gravity in South Africa will continue to shift leftward as well. So yeah, it's quite bleak, and that's why, again, as we always say on this show, Cape independence and self-determination more broadly is absolutely essential in order to protect the rights of cultural, linguistic, ethnic, and ideological minorities inside South Africa. And yeah, I think that's a perfect point to move on to then the Future of Nations conference, which was a amazing conference that took place earlier this week in Pretoria. It took place pretty much over 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday, and had guests from across South Africa and across the world. And there hasn't been too much media coverage on it, but if I can just share my screen here, um, there was one outlet that reported on it, which of course is The Guardian. And they framed this as New York young Republican club leader to speak in Pretoria, cementing bonds with Afrikaners and European far right. So, of course, this is The Guardian. They want to present this as a far right extremist event. It couldn't be anything further from the truth. By the way, the Guardian wasn't even there, so they're just guessing literally on this. There was no Guardian representative there. They're just making things up effectively. Oh yeah, they asked a few representatives of like African studies at the University of Oxford what they thought about this event, and they also weren't at the event, so I don't really know what the purpose of their feedback was. There's seemingly no comment here from Aaron Struitz or Stefano Forte, the president of the New York Young Republican Club. Um, they claim they reached them out for comment, but they haven't updated the article at any point. But yeah, this goes to show what the mainstream left wing narrative of this has been, at least from some of the affiliates of many of our mainstream media outlets here in South Africa. They've been very quiet. But in terms of this being a far right extremist event, if we were just to look at the lineup of people that took part in this, of speakers, it also seems very far from the truth. So this is Yaku Kleinans, who was also one of the speakers at the event, the international spokesperson for Solidarity. And if you go through the list of speakers on the program, you've got the likes of Davi Rut. I don't think he's necessarily a far right extremist. You've had uh, Arends van Zijl, again, he's on the conservative side of things, but I wouldn't present him as a very extreme person in that regard. You then had the likes of Koos Milan, constitutional jurist, Princess Balakazi, one of the representatives of one of the Eastern Cape royal families from the Xhosa side of things. Um, Prince Mashishile, I certainly don't think he's a far right extremist. Rob Hersov, and the list goes on. Martin van Staden, David Ansara, classical liberals slash libertarians from the Free Market Foundation. So clearly, this was an event consisting of literally, from what I could see, it felt like there were hundreds of people at the event, hundreds of think tank experts, policymakers, politicians, um, uh, influencers, the full range of people there from different ideological backgrounds, and they were coming together to really address a number of questions, facing nations today, facing many. And I've said in an article I'm writing, a lot of these questions are very different depending on the national context that they emerge in, but they all seem to rhyme in one way or another. So one of the people speaking there was Tom van Grieken, who is the leader of Vlaams Belang in Flanders, in Belgium. They're the Dutch-speaking part of the country, and yeah, they came second in the last elections there. They're a very strong party. They support Flemish independence from Belgium. And you can see very much in the case of Flemish independence, a very strong parallel with Cape independence in the sense that there's a demographic time bomb attached to both. So Flanders and particularly Brussels has been subject to mass immigration over the last few decades, to the point now that according to their stats, Flemings will be a minority in Flanders by the year 2040 on the most optimistic timeline. Now, that's very similar to what we're looking at with the Cape at the moment, which is at some point in the 2030s, the legacy communities that form the Cape, that those who can trace their ancestry back in one way or another to either the indigenous Khoisan or the Khoisan, the descendants of slaves or the descendants of European settlers and others, they'll end up finding themselves very quickly a minority in the Cape and replaced in many areas by mass migration from other parts of South Africa and other parts of the African continent. So we've clearly got similar parallels in our existential challenges we face. Obviously, there's been attacks on uh, institutions in the West that have been the basis of Western civilization for centuries. The radical left has gone after them. We've obviously seen that in South Africa as well, where they've gone after Stellenbosch University simply for being an Afrikaans university. We've seen many other aspects of public institutions being destroyed because of their Western connotations. So clearly, there's a lot of parallels in our struggles here. But one advantage we've currently got compared to many of these countries is being a minority, Afrikaners have had to have their plan B as their plan A. So that institution building, parallel institution building, has been something that they've been perfecting over the last 20, 30 years. And it's something that I think only in the West now are they starting to realize maybe that's what they've got to look to. If they are going to be a minority in Flanders, for example, what institutions can they start to build in order to protect themselves? Um, and I think that's a very that puts us in a very interesting position in South Africa. And I think that's why this event is so important, because you really don't get many gatherings of primarily conservatives and nationalists that take place in South Africa with an international audience to them. And I think the fact that we're starting to see that now is a sign that South Africa's history and its current situation is moving more and more away from the periphery of the Western civilizational discourse, more to the center, as a model of not only what to avoid, but also what to do in order to protect yourself in that situation. I've got more to say, but Leo, what would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, so I think it's this sort of talk shop discussion, you know, contact building, bridge building uh, activity is so important. And like you said, has absolutely non-existent in South Africa for the most part, at least not to this scale, right? It's the any sort of genuine conservative intent in South Africa is mostly limited to having to essentially go off completely detach yourself from the wider discourse and do your own thing. Which, to be fair, without that, probably the parallel institutions under discussion right now wouldn't have emerged, or at least not have been as robust as they are today. So not all, even in the struggle, there are silver linings. But I think for you know one of the really important things, and this is going to be true so long as South Africa or any Western country are still mostly democratic, still mostly governed by liberal principles. You have to sort of build consensus about what, how to get these things done. What sort of not just what we're wanting to build towards, but actually agree to move forward together in this way and say yes, we have to distance ourselves from the wider discourse for whatever reason, but now we have to sort of form a united front and inject ourselves into the discourse to 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 steal the words of future DA leader Donald Lewis. We need to unite. There needs to be there's lots of forces that want to make sure that genuine dissident conservative voices are fractured and quibbling on of like irrelevant details. But as long as we can have these sorts of consensus community building activities well, I think not only will we find ourselves with more resources at our disposal, but also with just a clearer understanding of what we can do and what is actually appropriate in time. Often difficult, I think, especially for the Western, they want to do something. They know that what's happening is wrong in some way, dispute it, or they know it for some well-defined ideological, uh, but they don't really know what is appropriate. And I know in Denmark now, for example, they talk about they have a by Danish standards pretty far right uh, candidate making some way explicitly calling for uh, like Muslims not assimilated and if you're somebody in the UK who believes that or at least feels in some way that it's breaking, like you don't know what to do. You want to say no, we just can't accept more people from these regions, or we're going to have to just accept that you're going to be a minority in some areas. This is it's a very, I would say, confusing time for past all the sort of brashness that we've grown used to from some of the right wing voices in the West. A lot, for the most part, they're still very confused about what to actually do, and I think this is exactly what to talk people who have made some more experience or have some different ideas to gauge what actually needs to be done.
And I think a big part of it as well comes down to too often the notions of nation and state have been conflated very closely with one another, but they're actually very two concepts at their core. Obviously, we know that in South Africa as well. I think people try and claim that South Africa is a nation state, and we see that with references to the national government or national symbols or the state of the nation. But that's really just appropriating the language of nationhood when actually that isn't the case in South Africa's context. But there was a very interesting point made again by Tom van Grieken, the leader of the Flemish nationalists, and he pointed out that obviously it hasn't always been the case that they've had this current constitutional dispensation in Belgium. For a long time, Belgium was formed, I think, in 1830, and for the longest time, even though Flemish people were the majority in the country, their language and their culture and their traditions were marginalized in favor of the French South. So they weren't allowed to use their language in government, in the courts, etc. And it was by the 1970s, I believe it was between 1970s and 1990s, Belgium underwent a process of reform which saw them move from a more unitary form of state to a federal form of state. And it was very interesting what he pointed out there, because obviously it's great to be able to exercise your right to self determination and have more powers for yourself. But you mustn't lose sight of the prize in that objective, because he said actually getting more institutions of the state granted to them has made them actually more lazy in the process. So you don't necessarily see that same drive for full sovereign independence as a result, because people are quite complacent with the status quo. And they shouldn't be, because if you become a minority in that territory, then eventually the institutions of that state that governs that territory won't serve that nation anymore. Serve the majority that exists in that territory, and then you're basically back at step one again, where you don't actually have any institution serving your nation. So you've got to have a very, very clear, distinct. So I think obviously I agree that you need to pursue self-determination, but when you're building these institutions, they shouldn't be self-serving institutions that can potentially exist once the nation, that can exist beyond the nation. Basically, they've always got to keep the nation in mind when they're being constructed. And I think a great example of that is, the first evening of the conference. There was a special event that took place at the Voortrekker Monument, and I was lucky enough to be able to go to the roof of the Voortrekker Monument, and you can see everything for miles around. And it's a great contrast, because at the Voortrekker Monument site, you've got this well-maintained area, great historical artifacts looked after, clean, just a very pleasant experience to be able to be there. And then you look out, and you've got the UNISA campus, just on the next hill. which has imploded. You've got Pretoria CBD in front of you, which again has imploded. And then you see the Union buildings, which is basically the source of all our centralized catastrophe. So I think it was actually a great contrast. The Voortrekker Monument there, privately run for the benefit of the Afrikaner nation, and then you've got all of these other institutions that are being managed by a centralized state that doesn't serve any one particular nation. So I think that was a great contrast that you can see from that vantage point.
Yeah, and I think it. I'm reminded of sort of future that France Fournier warns about South Africa trending towards uh, sort of de facto decentralization. States just become so where he suggested that the national government would only control the country as far as the gates of the union building. But I think, unfortunately, that is sort of what you're seeing in a lot of areas of South Africa at this point. You know, it's TVP is completely deteriorating. There's sort of just a lack of control over the actual happening of it. And when you have these sort of private institutions that are one accountable to a much smaller, more invested group of people, and also very important are sort of have to survive by their own means because otherwise they'll go bankrupt. Then there's just uh, there's just a greater control over what goes on. Right? You don't have to worry about the state of the police that is in your neighborhood or area is just fallen apart. That's not something, or if it is something you should still worry about at times, but it's something that you have a lot more direct control over if you have sort of decentralized, private, independent from the government.
Yeah, I mean, going, the public infrastructure around Pretoria. I mean, I've rarely been up that way in the last few years, but driving from our accommodation to the Voortrekker Monument, every second traffic light was out of service. And when you're driving back in the dark with no light, or with no lights around you, it's a very perilous thing in order to do. But yes, I mean, look, and look, any solution is going to require, I think, a bottom-up approach in South Africa, and that's in part as well because of how nations are structured. Because nations aren't really top-down, not entities, but concepts. They emerge from individuals or families who together form communities, who together form the bedrock of nations. So it's very much a bottom-up approach, and that's what our solutions are going to require. So I've been obviously a big proponent of the idea of see what you can do at the local level. Where can you take powers back as a community, especially if you're in an area of major dysfunction? But then don't just look at your community level. Try and then network with other communities who are in similar situations to you and try and build networks that way so you can take advantage not only of network effects but of economies of scale. Maybe there are certain projects that a community of 2,000 people cannot afford to finance, or it wouldn't make any economic sense in order for them to do it. But if you've got 50 or 100 towns that have taken on these functions for themselves, that can network with one another, the hundreds of thousands of people, then suddenly a lot more is potential in the South African system. And this was one thing I was also arguing at the conference in a number of discussions I had is once you can start to build these institutions, especially because now international recognition politics is starting to radically shift. And Palestine's a great example of that, where in the past you would have domestic sovereignty first, and then that would lead to you getting international legal sovereignty. Now it's been inverted, where in the case of Palestine, they got international recognition first before they actually achieve domestic sovereignty, and that precedent that's been set, the Palestinian precedent, as the Times of Israel writer Grant Gochin refers to it as, that potentially can lead on a domino effect in other parts of the world. And I think specifically what emerged after the conference with Lex Libertas and the New York Young Republican Club is very, very important in that regard because they've agreed on a number of action points, the two organisations, in terms of international recognition for some of the problems facing South Africa. Um, but the main focus of that action point list is the launch of an international petition calling on the United States to appoint a special envoy dedicated to engaging with the Afrikaner community and other cultural minorities in South Africa and to recognize the pursuit of self-governance as a legitimate and peaceful solution. So I think it's we have to wait and see how influential the New York Young Republican Club are in getting this point across in the United States. But if this can actually be achieved, I think that's a very good first step on the pathway to Afrikaner, but also other communities in South Africa, including the Cape, getting that recognition on the international global stage. And it could be a additional path to getting sovereignty that coincides with the other institution building paths that are taking place on the ground level in the country as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think, especially in this sort of, I shouldn't say descent, because skeptical that whatever, but this descent into a much more lawless approach to international relations that we've sort of grown accustomed to in recent years. We shouldn't think now that the international connections are in some way, frivolous. That the United States in particular, but also countries like Russia in much very different ways, are quite open to conversations about reshaping the way, well, the world map itself, but also the way countries sort of view their own sovereignty. You know? Part of the justification for action in uh, in Gaza, in Iran, or even in Ukraine, they sort of explicitly make this case that sovereignty only extends as far as your treatment of the people within your borders. And if the United States, for whatever reason, is convinced that Afrikaans, to the extent that they have already, but maybe in a future extent, whatever they if they view that any group like the Afrikaans in South Africa are being oppressed or in some way are being experiencing ethnocide, then there's certainly room for quite drastic action. Probably nothing uh, kinetic in nature, probably no military intervention, but a more robust uh, uh, backing of self-determination, ground up, and they do need to be ground from the ground up. This is where the people is where the legitimacy ultimately lies. But it would certainly help if the US made explicit overtures to supporting the.
It's a bit like a chicken and egg situation. Obviously, I think in a lot of cases, yeah, the international community needs to, or specifically the Americans need to see a strong presence on the ground taking place in order for them to have something tangible to support. But at the same time, if people locally can see actually they're not going to be alone if they try and pursue more powers for themselves. They've actually got people elsewhere who are quite powerful who are going to support them. It becomes a bit of a positive feedback loop. So the more people that support it, the more international support you get, and vice versa. So yeah, we'll just have to see what happens there. I believe that look, the New York Young Republicans, I think after the conference, they headed down to Irania, so it'll be interesting to see what their experiences are. And then, yes, my understanding is some of them are coming down to Cape Town as well. So it will be interesting to see what they take back as the contrast between the rest of South Africa and the west of South Africa in the form of the Cape. So yeah, we'll just have to see what comes from that. But yeah, I think that's all we've got for the future of nations aspect. I don't think there's anything more on your side, Leo, if, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I think the only thing we have to always pitch at the end of each one of these episodes, of course, is Prism. So make sure to get your copy of Prism. There's some really interesting pieces in there. Some from speakers at the Future of Nations conference. So I know Martin van Staden has a great piece in there. Leo, obviously, you've written for Prism as well. You've got a great piece in there on the Natal independence movement. And then, of course, there's a large number of pieces in there from the Cape Independence editor, Mr. Rob Dygan, who unfortunately hasn't been with us for the last couple of weeks. But maybe we're going to have him at the least for the next episode going forward.
Well,
But
he's just
yes,
finished writing his book, hasn't he? I think
oh
in that
yes, of course,
process. He's
yes, of
yeah,
course, he's
he's
got
a
that
very
book.
busy man.
Yes, so and I think he's the intention there, of course, is to get that out in the next few months to see what type of impact that's going to have on the wider political discourse as we enter a very interesting time with the local elections coming up and the DA leadership election coming up. So we'll have to see what comes from that. But yeah, other than that, nothing else to leave things on other than thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, Leo. Yeah, Leo.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say this edition of Prism will, if I'm not mistaken, about uh, the elite in South Africa and sort of whoever elite has existed for decades, basically South Africa style. I think that's the focus.
Okay, well, looking forward to that next publication. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for this slightly shorter than usual podcast. And yes, we'll see you this time next week. Cheers, everyone.
There's